No gunfights, no sunsets, just dust, silence, and a heat that didn't care who you were. The real Wild West wasn't about shootouts. It was about surviving boredom, thirst, and brutal stillness. If you were dropped into it with nothing but your boots and bravado, you wouldn't last the day. Tonight, we'll slow down and step into that quiet, unforgiving world where time crawled and the sky never ended. Before we begin, like and subscribe if these sleepy stories help you unwind. And in the comments, let me know what time it is where you are and which country you're listening from. I love seeing how far this sleepy little campfire reaches. Now pull your blanket close and let the dust settle. Let's begin. The silence between the spurs. It doesn't begin with a shootout or a gallop across a red canyon. It begins, like most truths do, with dust and silence. Not the movie silence, where a harmonica hums and tension thickens. No, this is a real, yawning quiet. The kind that settles over bone-dry land when even the wind forgets to blow. When the sky stretches too wide, too empty, and even the crows stay still. You're standing there, boots new, hat tilted just right, your breath already catching on the dryness of the air. It isn't the heat that greets you first. It's the absence of everything, of convenience, of noise, of comfort. You are alone with the sun and the sand and a pair of creaky boots that aren't broken in yet, and suddenly you feel it, how far away the rest of the world has become. This is the Wild West, not the one with duels and daring. The real one. The one where survival is slow, where days stretch long and uneventful, where danger doesn't shout, it waits. You squint into the sun, but there's no help coming from the horizon. Just more of the same. Dry brush, broken fences, and somewhere in the distance, the low groan of cattle or the soft click of a windmill turning tiredly as if it too has seen too much. You feel the sweat bead at your collar, but there's no shade, no breeze. You shift your weight, and already your back aches. The prairie doesn't care that you're tired. The West didn't wait for anyone. Not back then. To last even a day here required something different. Not strength in the way we think of it now, but endurance. The kind of quiet grit that didn't show off, that didn't boast, just did. You would need hands that didn't mind blisters, a stomach that didn't protest hard biscuits and beans, a skin that didn't sunburn after 10 minutes in the open. Already, you can feel the ache of your modern self, wondering where the water is, where the bed is, where, exactly, your phone might be. But there is no signal here, no outlet, no map to load, just stars, later, if you make it to nightfall. A rattlesnake doesn't care that you aren't ready. It doesn't rattle like they do in the stories. Sometimes, it just bites. And the water you find isn't clear. It's muddy, still, and warm. You boil it if you're smart. You don't drink too fast. You ration. You learn quickly how much thirst humbles. The dust never leaves your teeth. You wipe your brow. But your hand comes away with more dirt than sweat. And still, there is something quiet and haunting here. Something sacred in the stillness. The land may be cruel, but it is honest. The clouds drift slowly. and the silence between the chirps of insects feels like a rhythm, an old and forgotten lullaby, hummed by the earth itself. You look around. The town is 5 miles back, if you can call it a town. A few buildings leaning with time, a saloon that smells of spilled whiskey and boredom, and a general store where the shelves don't exactly overflow. You don't want to go back, not really, but out here, there's no one to talk to. You didn't realize how loud your thoughts could be when nothing interrupts them. The air is so dry it sings gently in your nose, and your boots creak every time you shift your stance, as if reminding you you're not quite one of them. Not yet. The Wild West was not wild in the way we pretend. It was slow, relentless. It wore you down, not with bandits or bullets, but with quiet, with the small things that added up. A broken well, a dead horse, a long drought, a neighbor who stopped visiting, a cough that lingered, a letter that never arrived. It was loneliness that did most folks in, not lead. Loneliness and time and the endless sky that reminded you just how small you really were. So no, you wouldn't last a day. But maybe in this strange moment, your boots planted, your lungs half full of dust and sun, you understand just a little how much life once demanded, how much silence once said, and how some stories didn't need to be loud to leave a mark. The coffee was cold, and so were the mornings. Morning doesn't come with a sunrise. It comes with a shiver. Before the light spills across the plain, before the birds remember to sing, the cold settles in like an old friend who's overstayed his welcome. You slept, if you can call it that, curled on a thin wool blanket, laid over a bed of uneven earth. Rocks press into your back, and your boots are still on, because you never know what might come crawling while you rest. Your breath rises in tiny clouds, and your hands sting as you unwrap them from your coat. There's no alarm clock, no gentle music, just the ache of your bones and the scratch in your throat and the distant sound of something moving. Maybe wind, maybe hooves, maybe nothing at all. You reach for the tin cup. It's dented, soot-stained, warm from the embers that never truly went out. You sip, and the coffee tastes like burnt bark and regret. It's gritty, it's bitter, and it's all you've got. There is no sugar, no cream, no slow Sunday morning. Just this, the morning ritual of the barely alive, trying to convince themselves they still are. You blow into your hands, but the warmth doesn't last. You move, because not moving means freezing. You stamp your feet, you stretch, and you mutter curses at the cold that never takes it personally. You glance at the sky. It's pale now, brushed in faded pinks and tired blues, and you think for a moment that it's beautiful, but you don't say it. Nobody did, not out here. Beauty was what you noticed in passing, never what you spoke aloud. It was fragile, like water. You didn't reach for it, you just let it pass through you. In town, if you're lucky enough to have walls and a roof, the cold still seeps in. The wood stove burns overnight, but only as long as someone feeds it. And you, half asleep in your cot or straw mattress, might wake to frost on the inside of the window. You don't get dressed. You add layers. You wrap your hands in rags and call them gloves. You try not to think about how long the day is about to be. Out here, warmth isn't something you have. It's something you earn. With sweat, with movement, with effort. And no matter what you do, it never lasts. You ride, and your fingers go stiff on the reins. You chop wood, and your knuckles crack. You breathe, and the air cuts deeper than it should. Even the animals feel it. The horses with their tails clamped tight. The dogs curled tight in the corners of barns. Cold in the west wasn't just a season. It was a presence. A low hum in the bones. A reminder that you didn't belong here. Not really. That if you stopped moving, stopped trying, stopped pushing, it would take you. Quietly. Completely. And still, you carried on. That was the deal. The sun would rise eventually, and you would wait for it, like a promise whispered through clenched teeth. The ground would thaw a little, and maybe by noon, you'd take off your coat. Maybe not. You didn't check a thermometer. You read the air through your breath and your toes, and the way the door creaked when you opened it. There were no forecasts. Just instinct, just memory, just the way the wind sounded when it meant snow. So yes, you could drink the coffee. You could feel the warmth, fleeting as it was. But you couldn't relax. Not yet. The West didn't reward comfort. It respected those who didn't expect it. You'd pack your things. You'd check your boots. You'd look toward the long road ahead and think, with a kind of tired resignation, just get through today, because that's all you could do. You didn't plan a week ahead. You didn't think about next month. You just got through the cold morning and hoped the afternoon would be easier. It rarely was, but even in the stillness, even in the ache, there was something honest about it all. You knew where you stood. The land didn't lie. It didn't flatter. It didn't care who you were yesterday. It asked only, will you try again today? And somehow, most days, you did. Now rest. Let the cold stay outside your blanket. Let the wind quiet. Let the coffee grow warm in memory, if not in your hands. Morning in the Wild West was never easy, but it always came. Slowly, quietly, just like sleep, the long walk to nowhere. You wake with a stiffness that doesn't fade. Not the kind you stretch away, but the kind that settles deep into the joints, quiet and old, like it's been waiting there for years. Your boots go on first, not because they're comfortable. They're not, but because the ground is colder than your feet. Every step echoes, even on dirt. The world hasn't quite stirred yet, but you have to start walking. Not because you want to, but because you have to. In the Wild West, walking wasn't an act of leisure. It was a sentence, a task, a ritual of movement in a land too vast to wait for you. There's a town up ahead. Maybe it's there. Maybe it isn't. People said it was 15 miles by horse, but your horse went lame 2 days ago and hasn't stood since. So it's 15 miles by foot now. Through flat scrub and aching sun and brush that cuts your legs when you try to take the shorter path. You wrap your canteen in canvas to keep it cool, but it doesn't help much. The water inside is already warm and scarce. You don't sip it, you ration it. the way you ration curses, the way you ration hope. The sun climbs, slow and without apology. It makes no secret of what it is. Blinding, relentless, heavy. You tie a cloth around your neck and pull your hat lower, but it doesn't do much. You keep walking, not because there's energy left, but because there's no choice. The road is barely a road, just a memory carved by wagon wheels and stubborn boots. Each step kicks up a whisper of dust, a soft complaint that settles on your clothes, your lips, your eyelashes. You blink against it. You taste it. You don't stop. Time stops meaning anything. There's no clock, no schedule, just sun and shadow, thirst and distance. You count steps in your head to keep from drifting. You hum sometimes. You think about food, real food, but even your imagination has given up. You'd settle for a boiled potato, even a tough biscuit, even a spoonful of lard scraped from a tin. Hunger makes poets out of cowards and beggars out of kings. Once in a while, you pass something. A rusted horseshoe, a broken wagon wheel, half sunk into the earth. The remains of someone else's plan. A warning, maybe, or a reminder. You think about the people who didn't make it. You wonder if they sat down to rest and just didn't get back up. You wonder if their bones are still out there, cracked open by time, picked over by crows. You don't look for them. You keep your eyes forward. The prairie doesn't owe you answers. It only asks questions. Quiet ones. The kind that get louder the longer you walk. Your mouth dries until it sticks. Your canteen's lighter now, not empty, but close. You wet your lips, just barely, and you walk. The heat climbs. The ground gets softer. Sand, now, more than dirt. Loose and slippery. Every step takes more from you than it gives. The horizon dances, a shimmer of light that lies. You know there's no lake out there, no river, no salvation. Just more heat, shaped like hope. In the distance, a shape. At first, it's just a smudge, then a sliver, then a structure. It's not the town, not yet. Just a shack, leaning like an old man in the wind. The roof is caved, one wall missing. But there's shade. You crawl beneath it, not because it's cool, but because it isn't sun. You sit with your back against the plank wall, and for the first time, your legs stop moving. They complain, they twitch, they're still. You rest, not in comfort, but in defeat. You don't sleep, not really, but your eyes close. The hum of insects rises around you. A fly lands on your cheek, and you swat it lazily, like someone who's learned that pain is relative. You dream, maybe, for a few minutes, or you just blink slowly. It doesn't matter. Time is soup out here, slow, hot, and thick. Eventually, you rise, not because you're ready, but because the sun is moving and you need to move with it. You stand, and your knees argue. Your shoulders ache like old doors. You drink the last of your water, knowing you shouldn't, but knowing, too, that what's ahead might take more than you've got. You walk again. Slower now. Every step is a conversation. Every breath is a debate. The road winds slightly. It doesn't help, just makes it harder to see what's ahead. You climb a small ridge, and finally, You see it. The town, a few buildings, a tall windmill, a water tower that might still hold water, though it leans like a drunkard against the sky. You let out a sound that isn't relief, just something like it, a cracked laugh, a breath that tries to be grateful and fails. You walk faster, not because you can, but because you must. You reach the edge of town. There's no welcome sign, no music, just the dull thud of your boots on worn planks. The saloon has its doors open, not out of hospitality, out of broken hinges. A man eyes you from a porch, chewing something slowly. He doesn't greet you. He doesn't move. You nod. He doesn't nod back. The West wasn't rude, just tired. You find the pump behind the general store. You crank it. Once. Twice. Nothing. You crank again. A groan. A squeal. Then water. Rusty, lukewarm, but wet. You let it hit your palms, your face, your lips. You drink too fast and regret it. But it's worth it. You live for now. Inside the store, shelves hold more dust than supplies. A few tins, a sack of flour with a hole in it. The clerk doesn't speak. You nod again. He nods, maybe. You leave a coin, maybe more than it's worth. You don't care. You made it, somehow. That night, you sleep in a barn. Not in a bed, on hay. The animals ignore you. The wind sings through the slats. You pull your coat over you and feel every bruise, every blister, every piece of you that almost didn't make it. You think, in the dark, this was just one day. One. And you wonder how anyone did this for years. The truth is, most didn't. Some left. Some died. Some gave up. But the ones who stayed, they weren't heroes. They weren't legends. They were quiet, steady, unremarkable. And still, they endured. The food wasn't hot, and it wasn't good either. You wake before the rooster crows. Not because you mean to, but because the barn gets cold in ways that feel personal. The wind snuck in through the cracks and curled up beside your spine like a judgment. The straw beneath you itched all night, and your boots, still on, of course, dug into your legs with a familiar ache. Morning hasn't arrived properly yet, but the world is turning gray with the weight of its own promises. You sit up, slowly, and everything complains. Shoulders stiff, back sore, mouth dry. You reach for your canteen, still empty, still waiting for a refill you can't guarantee. There's water out behind the store, but there's no coffee unless you make it, and there's no food unless you work for it. There are no breakfasts in bed in the Wild West, no cinnamon rolls, no buttered toast, no gentle eggs sliding off a warm skillet. Here, food is a chore before it's nourishment. A handful of beans, some salt pork if you're lucky, or a hard biscuit that's more rock than bread. You chew it slowly, not to savor it, but because it takes that long to soften enough to swallow. The beans are cold, always cold. You could heat them, but that means kindling, fire, waiting. And when hunger wakes you before the sun does, waiting feels like indulgence. You eat what's there, and what's there is rarely kind. You wrap the tin in cloth, not to keep it warm, but to stop it from burning your fingers if you do find a fire later. The utensils are few. A pocket knife, if you have one. A spoon, bent from years of service. If you're traveling light, you use your fingers. Out here, no one judges. Everyone's too tired to care. Manners melt under the weight of survival. You sit outside, watching a dog cross the road with more confidence than you've felt all week. It doesn't stop. It doesn't look back. It's hunting or scavenging, or maybe just existing, just like you. The town is barely awake. A curtain twitches in a window. A door creaks open, not for you, but for the world itself. People live here, if you can call it that. They drift in and out of their homes like ghosts, already burdened by the heat that hasn't arrived yet. The saloon keeper leans on his broom. The preacher adjusts the crooked sign out front. The windmill squeals. Nothing feels urgent, and yet everything does. There are chores to do, not because someone said so, because if you don't, you go hungry, you go thirsty, you go nowhere. You clean your boots because the dust becomes a second skin. You check your horse, if you still have one. You patch your coat. You sharpen your blade. Not for a fight, but for the meat you may never catch. You sweep, you haul, you lift. You do these things not out of pride, but because doing nothing feels like inviting the land to swallow you whole. Lunch is no better than breakfast. Maybe a strip of jerky that tastes like leather dipped in salt. Maybe cornmeal, if you've got enough to grind. You eat in silence. Not because you're alone, necessarily, but because conversation requires energy that food barely gives. Meals are functional. They pass through you like ghosts. They never quite satisfy. They never quite fill. And still, you keep eating. Because there is no other choice. By afternoon, the heat takes over. Not a sharp heat, not a burning heat, but a heavy, sleepy kind of warmth that settles on your shoulders like a too thick coat. You move slowly, not out of laziness, but because there's no reward for moving fast. You'll still be hungry. You'll still be tired. You'll still be here. Dinner, when it comes, is sometimes the best meal of the day. Not because it's good, but because it's warm. If someone had the fire going, if someone remembered to stir the pot, if someone had the patience to mix flour with lard and make something that rises even a little. You eat with a quiet reverence, not for the flavor, but for the heat. A bowl of stew, if you're lucky. Thin, watery, filled with too much broth and not enough meat. You don't complain. You swallow. You let it coat your insides and pretend, just for a moment, that it's comfort. You chew each bite like it matters, because it does. No one counts calories. No one asks about gluten. No one debates dairy. You eat what doesn't kill you. You eat what doesn't rot. You eat what stays. The meat is salted within an inch of its life. The bread is hard by sunset. The vegetables are rare and bruised. A tomato is a luxury. A ripe apple is a miracle. And sugar is the stuff of legend. You taste it once a year maybe, on Christmas, in a pie made from dried fruit and memory. The cook, if there is one, isn't thanked. There's no applause, no compliments, just nods, just the scraping of spoons on metal plates. The cook doesn't expect gratitude. just silence, just empty bowls. And after, the cleanup. Not because cleanliness is next to godliness, but because if you don't scrub your pot, something will live in it. You wash it with sand if there's no soap. You rinse it with old water, then let it dry in the air that never stops watching. You hang your tools. You wrap the bread. You tuck the beans away, hoping mice don't find them first. And when you lie down, back on the floor or in the barn or on the cot made of stretched canvas and hope, you don't think about the taste. You think about whether it'll be there tomorrow, whether you'll find more, whether it'll be enough. The Wild West didn't serve meals. It offered them like tests. Could you chew something flavorless and be thankful? Could you eat the same thing for 7 nights straight and call it luck? Could you smile with a mouthful of ashes and say, well, at least it's warm? If you could, maybe, just maybe, you'd make it another day. Now, sleep. Let your stomach quiet. Let the faint warmth in your belly become a cradle. Let the fire crackle in memory and not in need. You ate. You endured. That is enough. For tonight, you were always dirty, and you never stopped itching. There is no real clean in the Wild West. Not the kind you're used to. Not the warm shower. Not the lavender soap. Not the soft towel waiting nearby. Clean, back then, was a concept more than a condition. A rumor passed between travelers who hadn't yet learned that the wind and the dust had their own ideas. You didn't wash because you wanted to feel fresh. You washed because the dirt had started to feel like part of your skin, and you needed, just for a moment, to remember that you were human beneath it. But even that didn't last, not out here. You start the day itchy, always itchy. Your neck from the collar of your shirt, your legs from the seams of your trousers, your hands from the grit and calluses and dried soap. If you found soap at all, everything rubs wrong. Nothing fits quite right. The dust works its way into every fold, every line of your skin, every quiet part of your body you never thought about until it started to ache. You wipe your face, but the cloth is as dirty as your hands. You scratch behind your knee, and your fingernails come away with something dark beneath them. Water is precious. Not something you pour over your head just because the day was long. You fill your canteen before you clean your face. You rinse your mouth before you wash your hands. You make choices, small ones, but they matter. And sometimes the decision is simple. Go to bed filthy or go to bed thirsty. More often than not, you choose the dirt. You learn to live with it, to accept it, to wear it like a second skin that no one questions, because everyone else is wearing it too. You wash when it rains, if it rains. Not in the gentle, cinematic way, in the desperate way. Standing half-dressed beneath a gray sky, hands out, mouth open, rubbing your arms like a child pretending the water is warm. It never is. It runs cold and sharp and straight through you. But it takes the edge off the stink, just for an hour or two. The stink is constant. Your body, your clothes, the people around you. Sweat dried into cloth, turned sour by the sun. Leather soaked in your scent. Hats crusted with months of grime. You don't notice it after a while, not because it goes away, but because It becomes the air you breathe, like smoke in a room, like heat on the wind. You just adapt. There were baths, sometimes, in towns, in little rooms with iron tubs and chipped enamel, where you paid 2 bits for the privilege of lukewarm water and a bar of lye soap. You'd scrub hard, like you were trying to erase the week. You'd watch the water darken as the dirt left you in rings. The towel was never clean. The soap left you raw. But you felt something, close to relief, close to comfort. Then you'd put the same clothes back on, and within an hour, it was as if you never bathed at all. Lice were common, fleas too. You learned to feel them before you saw them. A crawling sensation at the base of your skull, a twitch at your wrist. You'd strip down and search your seams, but they always found a way back. Combs were treasures. You heated them over flame, not for style, but for killing. Blankets were beaten, not fluffed. You didn't ask if someone had bugs. You just assumed they did. Your fingernails were broken more often than not. Dirt packed beneath them, sharp and dry. Your hair turned stiff, and your scalp flaked. You wiped your face with sleeves, with rags, with anything that seemed slightly less filthy than your skin. Sometimes you found a creek. If it wasn't dried up, if it wasn't crawling with leeches, you'd kneel and splash your face and hope it didn't make you sick. It often did. And still, the world didn't stop for you to feel clean. Chores waited. Animals waited. The trail didn't care how you smelled. The fence didn't mind your fingernails. The prairie had no regard for how your shirt clung to your back in the heat. It just watched. It just endured. And so did you. There were moments, though, quiet ones, when the wind shifted just right and blew the dust away from your eyes. When the clouds passed overhead and the sweat dried on your skin. When you sat still enough that the itch paused. Those were the good moments. They didn't come often, but they reminded you that beneath the grime, you were still there. And you began to admire the people who kept going. The woman who washed her children's faces every morning with a cloth soaked in yesterday's water. The man who sharpened his straight razor and shaved in a broken mirror, even when no one would see him. The girl who brushed her tangled hair with her fingers and tied it with a piece of twine. There was dignity even in dirt. There was something human in the effort, however small. But for the most part, you itched. You itched through supper, through sleep, through sunrise. You scratched your arms and ankles without thinking. You wiped your neck and left a streak. You coughed and tasted dust. You bent to tie your boots and smelled your own socks. And you moved on. Because the Wild West didn't offer hygiene. It offered survival. And survival meant compromise. You were always dirty, and you never stopped itching. The air was dry, and so was your throat. The day doesn't begin with thirst. You wake inside it. Your mouth is dry before your eyes even open. Your tongue feels like sandpaper pressed between 2 pieces of flannel, and your lips sting as you part them, already cracking at the corners. You swallow instinctively and feel the absence. Not a lack of moisture, but a hollowness, as though your throat has been rubbed raw by the very act of breathing. The air out here doesn't carry comfort. It takes more than it gives. It pulls the dampness from your skin, your lungs, your mouth, and still, it keeps blowing. The Wild West didn't have humidity. It had dust that moved like breath, wind that forgot to be kind, and skies that rarely wept. Clouds passed overhead like promises unkept, always just out of reach. The earth beneath your feet was cracked, like old paint, like pottery left too long in the sun. The grass was brittle, whispering as it broke beneath your boots. And all around you, the world spoke in the language of dryness. You reach for your canteen, knowing what you'll find before your fingers even touch it. Light. Too light. You unscrew the top anyway, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the weight of your desire will summon something. A sip. A swallow. A mouthful. You tip it back, and a single drop finds its way past your teeth. Not enough to help. Just enough to remind you of what you're missing. Thirst becomes a constant companion. It doesn't scream. It hums. It sits quietly in the back of your mind, nudging every thought toward water. You think of streams, of creeks, of wells and barrels and tin cups sweating in the shade. You imagine rain hitting the roof, the scent of it, the sound of it. You imagine a pitcher of cold lemonade beaded with condensation, the way it would feel against your palm. But imagination doesn't hydrate, and dreams don't pour. You walk slower, you speak less, not from fatigue, but from preservation. Every word costs moisture. Every exhale leaves you drier. You learn to breathe through your nose. You learn not to lick your lips, no matter how they beg for it. You tie a cloth around your face when the wind kicks up, not to look tough, but to stop the dust from scratching your throat raw. You pull your hat lower, because the sun on your head is a thief, and it steals whatever water your body tries to hold. By midday, your joints ache, not from work, but from dehydration. Your eyes sting. Your skin cracks at the knuckles. And yet, you keep moving. Because the only way out is forward. There are no fountains, no shade trees with cool springs hidden beneath. Just the hope that the next town, the next camp, the next stop might have a barrel that hasn't gone dry. Might have a bucket half full, sitting in the shadow of a broken porch. Sometimes you pass another traveler. Their lips are white at the edges, their eyes sunken. Their voice is barely there when they speak, if they speak at all. They nod, you nod. No one wastes spit on conversation. You trade a swig for a biscuit, or a strip of jerky, or a story told in gesture alone. And then you part ways, each holding a little more than you had before, but never enough. The irony is cruel. Even when you find water, it's rarely clean. It tastes of tin, or mud, or worse. You filter it through cloth. You boil it if you have time. You hold it in your mouth like a secret before swallowing. Sometimes it makes you sick, but you drink it anyway. Because not drinking is worse. The saloon offers whiskey, but that's not hydration. That's distraction. You take it some nights. A burn down the throat to replace the ache, but it doesn't last. It leaves you drier than before, with a head full of heat and a stomach full of regret. Real relief comes only from water. Cool, clear, clean, and rare. The water table out here is temperamental. Wells dry up without warning. Rivers change course like they've forgotten where they're supposed to be. You mark maps. You dig holes. You listen to the old timers when they say, "Follow the animals. They know where it is." You watch the sky, but the sky doesn't care. It stays blue when you need gray. And when it finally rains, it comes too fast in bursts that flood the dry earth without soaking in. The mud clings to your boots. The water runs off. You drink what you can, from your hands, from the catch of your hat. You fill your canteen, and then it's gone again. You learn to savor every drop. You count them. You hoard them. You dream of them. Water isn't a background detail in the Wild West. It's the story, the plot, the driving force behind every choice. Where to settle, where to stop, where to go next. Every journey is shaped not by comfort or curiosity, but by thirst. Evening brings no mercy. The air cools, but it doesn't soften. The wind still carries dust. You cough once, twice, and spit into the dirt, watching it disappear as if it was never there. You lie back on your blanket and close your eyes, feeling the dryness in your nose, in your throat, in the skin stretched tight over your cheeks. You sleep with the canteen beside you, half full. You don't drink it, not yet. It's for tomorrow, always tomorrow. And you wonder, quietly, how people manage this. Not for a day, but for years, for lifetimes. They didn't have hydration tablets, or bottled water or ice. They had barrels and buckets, leather skins and hope. They endured. Not because they were stronger, but because they had to be. You wouldn't last a day, you think again. And maybe you're right. But still, here you are. Breathing, hoping, swallowing against the ache, holding on to that last mouthful like it's a promise. Sleep now, even if your throat is dry. Let the wind fade. Let the dust settle. Let your dreams be of rain on tin roofs, of rivers winding through canyons, of cold water cupped in both hands. You are thirsty, but you are still here. And tomorrow, maybe you'll find a little more. The wind never stopped, and neither did the noise. The sound isn't loud. It's not thunder, not shouting, not the crack of a gun echoing across a canyon wall. It's quieter than that. Quieter, but constant. A kind of hum, a whisper made of grit and movement and breath. It is the wind, and it never stops. Not really. It changes. Sometimes, softening, shifting, turning from one direction to another like it's trying to make up its mind. But it is always there, sliding across the ground, stirring the dust, singing through the cracks in the barn wall or beneath the door frame, wrapping around your ears like a thread you can't untangle. In the Wild West, silence was a myth. Not because of people. They were mostly quiet, too tired for talk, but because the land never held still. Even when no one spoke, even when every boot had stopped moving, the world around you made its own kind of music. The creak of a dry tree, the rustle of brittle grass, the flap of laundry on a line, snapping like small flags surrendering to the day. The call of a crow, distant, indifferent. The squeal of the windmill turning in the yard, slow and uneven, crying out with each gust, as though it had something to confess. You'd lie down at night and think you were finally alone with your thoughts. But the wind came in anyway, through the rafters, beneath the boards, past the gaps in the window you'd tried to stuff with rags. It carried everything: cold, dust, the scent of distant fires, and sound, always sound. A low whistle, a high moan, a strange groan that made the floorboards answer, even when no one walked on them. You'd wake in the dark and not know what stirred you. The wind, most likely, or what the wind brought. And during the day, it didn't stop. It whipped your coat open when you tried to button it. It pulled your hat from your head when you weren't paying attention. It stung your eyes, filled them with dust until you wept without meaning to. You'd curse it, softly at first, then louder, but the wind didn't care. It didn't take offense. It just kept going, pulling at you, tasting you, testing you. You never walked straight against it. You leaned, bent slightly at the waist, arms close to your chest, hat low, like you were pushing into the very shape of the day. And when you turned your back on it, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like vulnerability, like something could come riding in behind it. The wind was never just wind. It was messenger. It carried the scent of rain, if you were lucky, the stink of cattle, if you weren't, the burnt wood smell of a far-off prairie fire that might not reach you, but might. Sometimes it carried voices. You'd swear you heard someone call your name, but there was no one there. You'd look over your shoulder, and the horizon would be empty. Or worse, full of shadows that looked like movement, but weren't. You'd hear the echo of laughter that faded as soon as you turned your head. Was it memory? Dream? The wind knew, but it never told. Noise in the west wasn't sharp. It wasn't sudden. It wore you down. The squeak of wagon wheels that needed greasing. The drip of a leak in the roof that no one had time to fix. The scraping of metal on stone as someone sharpened a blade without hurrying. The clink of tools being sorted. The crunch of boots on gravel over and over until you forgot it wasn't your own. It wasn't loud. It was relentless. In town, there was more. The piano from the saloon played half-heartedly. The jingle of spurs walking past your window. The bell above the store door, tinkling in the same tired way, no matter who came through it. The bark of a dog, 3 buildings away. A shout, a laugh, a slap, then quiet again. The kind of quiet that wasn't really quiet at all. At night, the animals had their say. Horses shifted in their stalls. A mule kicked a wall. Coyotes howled, far and faint. Owls asked questions you couldn't answer. Mice scratched along the beams above your bed. Somewhere, a rooster got confused and crowed at the moon. You laughed once, quietly, but no one else did. The wind stirred them all, and you. Rest was a challenge, not a gift. You'd drift off, only to wake to the sound of your own heartbeat, trying to match the rhythm of the creaking walls. Sometimes you'd hum to yourself, just to add a new sound to the mix. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But slowly, you stopped noticing. The wind didn't leave, but it became familiar. like a voice you learned to stop listening to, like a companion who didn't speak your language, but stayed near anyway. You knew how to sleep through the groans, how to walk with the whistle, how to hold still when the world wouldn't. That was the secret of the West. It wasn't quiet, but it taught you how to be. You learned that stillness didn't need silence, that rest didn't need peace, that the wind could sing you to sleep if you let it. Not with lullabies, but with persistence, with presence. Tonight, the wind is still blowing. Soft now, but steady. Let it hum through the cracks. Let it turn the wheel. Let it carry your worries far across the plains, where even coyotes won't find them. You're not alone in the noise. You never were. Sleep while the world whispers. Let the wind talk. And for once, let yourself listen. You couldn't trust the weather, and you couldn't trust the sky. There were no reliable forecasts in the Wild West, no neat 7-day charts, no satellite maps, no cheerful voice saying tomorrow would be partly cloudy with a chance of rain. There was only the sky, and the sky was a liar. It looked blue when it meant danger. It looked gray when it was empty. It could hold a storm behind a curtain of sunshine and open it like a trap door without warning. You learned not to trust what you saw. You learned to read the wind instead, the way it changed direction, the way the animals went quiet, the way the smell of the air turned metallic or thick like bread left too long in a hot room. The sky gave signs, but never in words, never in certainty. You could wake to sunshine and go to sleep soaked to the bone. You could step out into a still morning and be chased back inside by hail the size of your knuckles. A storm on the prairie didn't roll in. It slammed. Thunder didn't rumble. It cracked the sky like it was breaking glass. Lightning didn't flash. It struck hard and close, setting dry grass on fire with a single burning sentence. You didn't count the seconds between the flash and the sound. You didn't have time. You huddled in cellars, under tables, in the narrow space between courage and instinct. And still, sometimes, it found you. The rain that fell sideways, the wind that pried up roof shingles like paper, the cold that crept into the seams of your coat and lived there. Rain wasn't always a blessing. Sometimes it meant your roof would leak for a week. Sometimes it meant your road would vanish beneath a river of brown. Sometimes it meant you'd lose the seeds you'd planted yesterday, washed away before they had the chance to try. And in the summer, it was worse in its own way. The sky stayed too clear, the sun too high, weeks without rain, months without mercy. The soil turned to dust and blew away. The cattle wandered farther for water. The crops didn't come. You'd watch the horizon every morning for signs, a dark smudge, a distant flicker. But most days brought nothing, just heat, just silence, just the taste of disappointment in the back of your throat. Sometimes there was snow, even when you didn't expect it. Spring could break your heart like that. A week of warmth, a day of sun, then a storm that erased every green shoot in the garden. You'd have to start again, knowing you might not have enough seed left to try. The snow didn't ask. It didn't explain. It just came. Soft, white, beautiful, and cruel. It buried fences, froze wells, killed chickens, and still, it was just part of the story. No one cursed the sky for long. They knew it didn't care. Dust storms were worse than rain, worse than snow. The kind of storm that didn't fall. It rose, out of the ground, out of the horizon, like something summoned. You'd see it building in the distance. A wall of earth taller than the town, darker than night, faster than a man could run. You'd tie rags around your face and nail boards across your windows, and still, it would find a way in. Through the smallest cracks, under the doors, into your lungs, into your food. You'd breathe dirt for days, even after it passed. You'd cough in the quiet moments and feel it grind against your teeth. You'd scrub your floor, your hands, your skin, and still, you'd find it there. Tornadoes didn't announce themselves. They just appeared, like punishment, like punctuation. A tail hanging from the sky, lazy and slow and unstoppable. You didn't outrun them. You went underground and prayed. If you had a cellar, if you didn't, you found a ditch. If you couldn't, you held on. And in between all this, the rain, the snow, the dust, the wind, there were the days that tricked you. The beautiful ones. The ones with soft clouds and mild air and the scent of sage riding the breeze. Days that made you think it was all worth it. That maybe things had changed. That maybe this year, this season, this patch of land would be kind. You'd feel hope settle like dew on your shoulders. You'd breathe easier. And sometimes it lasted. But mostly it didn't. The Wild West didn't ask for your belief. It just tested it again and again and again. You learned to be ready, always, to tie things down, to dig drainage before you needed it, to mend the roof even when the sun was shining. You learned not to speak too soon, not to say, "It looks like a nice day," out loud, because the sky was listening, and it liked to prove people wrong. The people who lived through it weren't lucky. They were prepared, cautious, watchful. They read the wind and the way birds took flight. They watched the cattle. They listened for quiet, not as peace, but as a warning. Stillness meant something was coming. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't survive the storm, but because you wouldn't see it coming. You'd trust the sky, and the sky doesn't reward trust, only vigilance. Tonight, the sky might look peaceful. It might stretch wide and black, with stars like silver seeds scattered across velvet. But don't be fooled. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something is building. A shift in the pressure, a sigh in the grass, a shiver in the cottonwoods. The nights were long, and the darkness was real. When the sun finally gave up and slid behind the horizon, it didn't ease away gently. It dropped, quickly, like a door closing. One moment, you had light enough to see the dust rise from your boots, and the next, you were blind. The dark came early and stayed late, and in the Wild West, it wasn't soft. It wasn't lit by city haze or the lazy orange of a neighbor's porch lamp. There were no streetlights, no headlights, no soft glow of electronics humming on a nightstand. There was only the black, and the cold, and the sound of everything you couldn't see. You would light a lantern if you had one, a stub of candle, maybe, a fire if there was wood to spare. But those lights were small, flickering, fragile. They cast shadows more than they gave clarity. The flame shook every time the wind sighed against the wall, and your own silhouette stretched across the floor like something waiting to move on its own. You'd sit close to it, not because you were afraid of the dark, exactly, but because you respected it. You knew what could live out there, just beyond the reach of firelight. Coyotes howled first, not one at a time, but in chorus, like a choir raised by hunger. You'd hear them far off, then closer, then far again, moving like ghosts, circling, not daring to come close. Not yet. Owls asked questions no one answered. Something rustled in the brush, a rabbit or a snake, or something worse. You didn't go to check. You didn't go outside unless you had to. And even then, you paused at the door, one hand on the frame, eyes trying to pierce the black for any shape that moved wrong. In town, it was a little better. A lamp in a window, a candle behind a curtain, the glow of the saloon if it was still open. But even then, the alleys stayed dark. The corners stayed empty. And behind every building was a silence thick enough to press on your chest. Sleep didn't come easily. Not when your ears were still working, still twitching toward every sound. Not when your bed was stuffed straw on a wooden plank, and the blanket felt like burlap wrapped in a memory. Not when the air was so cold it crept up from the floorboards and settled into your spine like regret. If you shared a room, you'd lie quiet together. No one whispered, no one told stories. There was nothing left to say, just the sound of breathing and shifting, and the occasional creak of wood, too slow to be footsteps, but not slow enough to ignore. If you were alone, the night was longer. You'd listen to the wind knocking gently on the shutters like it forgot something. You'd listen to mice chewing at the corner of the room. You'd think of all the things you couldn't see, and you'd lie very still. The dark in the west wasn't poetic. It wasn't romantic. It was practical. It marked the time when work stopped and worry began, when the world grew quiet and your mind got louder. You remembered things you'd rather forget. You imagined things that never happened, or maybe almost did. You thought of people you hadn't seen in years. You thought of the mistakes that lived in your chest like stones. Some nights, you slept out under the stars. Not by choice, because the cabin was full, or the wagon was broken, or you hadn't made it to the next town in time. You'd lay a blanket on the ground and pull another over you. You'd watch the sky, endless, enormous, humming with stars that didn't blink. The Milky Way stretched like spilled flour across a black table. The cold air bit your nose. Your hands curled beneath your arms. You closed your eyes and hoped the night would pass quickly. But it didn't. Nights were long. The minutes were thick. Time moved slowly. The fire burned low, and you waited. For dawn, for sleep, for nothing in particular. Sometimes you heard the whistle of a train, far off, a reminder that somewhere the world was moving. Somewhere people were awake, under oil lamps, eating something warm. But not here. Here, you had only the dark and the silence that came with it. And yet, in the deep of night, there was also peace, a kind of surrender. The world had done its worst for the day. It couldn't ask anything more of you, not until morning. You were allowed to rest, if not sleep, to lie still, to listen, to exist without expectation. No one knocked. No one needed help. You were free, in a way that felt strange and old. You might watch the moon rise, slow and indifferent, spilling silver across the plains. You might count the stars until your eyes couldn't stay open. You might listen to your own breath, steady and real, and know that at least for now, you had made it through another day. Sleep came eventually, not as a gift, but as a slow surrender. You didn't fall asleep. You drifted into it, like water pulling you under, softly, like dust settling on the floor after the wind passed through. And when you did sleep, you dreamed strange things, of green hills and soft beds, of meals you didn't have to cook, of water that flowed from taps, of silence that didn't threaten, and darkness that wrapped you gently instead of watching you. But then the rooster called, or the floor creaked, or the cold touched your toes, and you woke. The dark was leaving, the sky was lightening, and you were still there. You had survived the night, and now the day would begin again. The work was endless, and the tools were barely enough. There was no such thing as being done. Not out here. The idea of a day's work having a clear beginning and a satisfying end, it didn't exist. The Wild West wasn't shaped by schedules. It was shaped by needs, and needs, like wind and weeds, just kept coming. If you finished one thing, another was already waiting. A fence that needed mending, a stove that needed tending, a roof that leaked when the sky remembered how to cry. The land wasn't tamed, and it never pretended to be. It gave nothing freely, and what it took, it rarely returned. The tools you used weren't polished. They weren't precise. They were often handed down, rusted, chipped, or warped from use. The hammer handle had splinters, and the axe blade wobbled slightly. Your hands learned how to make them work anyway. You didn't throw away something just because it was cracked. You repaired it, you braced it, or you simply kept using it until it couldn't swing, dig, chop, or pull anymore. There was no hardware store down the road, no next-day delivery. If something broke, your day broke with it. You woke before light because the animals didn't understand sleeping in. The chicken squawked for feed, the cow waited to be milked, and the horses, if you had them, needed grooming, watering, checking for burrs, for blisters, for signs they were wearing down faster than you were. You didn't talk to them for fun. You spoke out of habit, a soft mumble, as much for your own mind as theirs. They didn't speak back, but they listened. Then came the fire. Always the fire. Before breakfast, before warmth, before anything else. You gathered kindling if you hadn't the night before, struck a match if you had one, or fumbled with flint and steel, hoping the wind didn't catch it wrong. Fire was how you started the day. And sometimes it was all you had to show for it. You boiled water, if there was any, and poured it over stale coffee grounds that had been reused more than they should. You heated beans. You fried salt pork, the kind that never went bad because it was already halfway to leather. You ate standing up. There wasn't time to sit. Then came the work. You didn't pick what to do. The work picked you. If the barn door was hanging, you fixed it. If the chickens got loose, you herded them. If the dog ran off chasing something it couldn't catch, you called and waited and hoped it came back. If it didn't, you moved on. The ground needed turning. The wood needed chopping. The axle needed greasing. The neighbor needed help with something they couldn't lift alone, and you went. Because someday, it would be you who couldn't carry what had to be carried. The sun didn't rise fast. It crawled. And as it rose, the sweat began. Not the kind that came from running, but the slow, steady kind that soaked your shirt as you stood still chopping or digging or hauling. You wiped your brow and left a smear of dirt across your temple. You scratched the itch that never went away. You rolled your shoulders and heard the creak of joints already too old for your age. You learned the difference between tired and done. Tired happened before breakfast. Done never came. And all the while, the tools resisted. The saw blade stuck in green wood. The handle of the shovel snapped mid-dig. The rake had 3 tines missing, but you used it anyway. You banged your knuckles, stubbed your toes, dropped nails that vanished into the dirt. You cursed sometimes, quietly, like a prayer meant for no one. And when the wind picked up, when the dust came in, you didn't stop. You squinted. You tied a rag around your mouth. You worked anyway. Because there was no later. There was only now or never. Lunch wasn't a break. It was a pause, a piece of bread if it hadn't gone stale, a strip of jerky that you chewed until your jaw ached, water that was warm and metallic but still holy. You sat on the edge of something, a stump, a step, a wagon wheel, and watched the wind bend the grass like a warning. Then you stood back up, not because you were rested, but because sitting too long made it worse. In the afternoon, the sun stopped forgiving. Your shadow shrank. The ground burned through your boots. You adjusted your hat again and again. You checked the horizon, not for weather, but for signs of trouble. A rider, a fire, a shape that didn't belong. Nothing ever came. But you checked anyway. You repaired. You rebuilt. You reminded the world you were still here, and every nail you hammered bent once before going in straight. Every board you cut splintered before it settled. But you kept going. Evening brought more chores, not fewer. You fed the animals, not because they thanked you, but because they relied on you. You closed the gate. You checked the latch. You swept the porch. You stacked the tools, not neatly, but near enough. You dragged your boots across the threshold, sat on the step, and let your hands rest in your lap like strangers you hadn't spoken to in years. And still, something needed doing. A stitch torn in your shirt, a crack in the stovepipe, a hinge that wouldn't sit right. You made a note of it, not on paper, but in your mind. the growing list of tomorrow, a list that grew faster than you could shrink it. And yet, this was the rhythm, the ache, the dust, the bending and lifting and dragging and patching, the tools that weren't right, the jobs that were never finished, the days that didn't end. They just faded into night like ink soaking into a shirt you couldn't afford to lose. You didn't complain, not because you liked it, but because there was no one to listen, and because the truth was, everyone else was just as tired. You wouldn't last a day, not because the work was too hard, but because it never stopped. Because in the Wild West, rest was a rumor, and enough was just a word you read once, somewhere before the page blew away. You didn't travel. You endured the road. The idea of going somewhere in the Wild West sounds simpler than it was. You might picture a wide, open trail and a confident rider moving briskly across it, coat flapping in the breeze, horse steady beneath them, the sun slanting just right over distant hills. But the real road wasn't a road at all. Not in the way you think. It was a scar across the land, rutted, unforgiving, sometimes muddy, sometimes cracked dry, often disappearing completely when the wind erased its edges. You didn't travel the road, you endured it, you negotiated with it, and most days you lost. Leaving town meant packing everything, not just your bags, but your expectations. You packed food that wouldn't spoil if you had it. Hard biscuits, salt pork, maybe a bit of dried fruit if you could afford the sweetness. You filled your canteen with water you prayed wouldn't run out. And you wore layers not for fashion, but because the mornings froze and the afternoons scorched, and there was no shelter once you left the last wooden building behind. You saddled your horse, if you had one, or hitched your mule, or simply adjusted your boots and walked. And when you crossed that invisible line between civilization and wilderness, the silence grew heavier. The road didn't care where you were going. It only asked how long you could keep going. Every mile was earned. Wheels broke. Axles snapped. A single rock could lodge beneath your boot and send pain up through your entire body. Dust stuck to your face like a second skin. You squinted into the sun because you had no choice. The brim of your hat only helped so much. There were no signs, no mile markers. You learned to read the land, where the buffalo grass thinned, where the fence posts slumped, where the trees leaned just so, to tell you whether you were still on track. You followed the bones of others who hadn't made it. A rusted wagon wheel, a broken crate, a boot half buried. They didn't scare you. They reminded you to watch your step. Travel was slow. A few miles in a day if the road was dry, less if it rained. The mud could swallow a wheel, a hoof, a man. You learned to listen to the sound of it, thick and sucking, and avoid the low spots. You learned to keep your weight back, to shift the balance, to pray under your breath when your cart tilted just slightly too far to one side. And if you were on horseback, it wasn't easier. Saddles rubbed, reins blistered, horses tired. You had to rest them, feed them, water them. You had to be gentle and firm and grateful all at once. They didn't complain, but they remembered. A horse that trusted you would carry you farther. A horse that didn't might not carry you at all. There were no inns between towns, no roadside shelters, Maybe a grove of trees, if you were lucky, a dry stream bed, a rocky overhang. You made camp wherever the day ran out. You gathered what wood you could, lit a fire small enough to hide but large enough to cook by. You warmed beans or soaked hard bread in water. You wrapped yourself in a blanket and tried to sleep with one ear open. Because the road wasn't empty. Wolves, snakes, people, all moved through it, most of them just as desperate as you. Sometimes you saw someone ahead or behind. You never rushed to meet them. You watched. You waited. If they waved, you waved back, slowly. If they didn't, you kept your distance. The road wasn't always cruel, but it was always cautious. Every stranger had a story. Some of them ended badly, and when it rained, the world changed. The dry, cracked earth turned to slop. The wagon sank. The horse stumbled. The cold found its way into your bones and refused to leave. You'd wrap yourself in oilskin or burlap, whatever you had, and huddle under the least wet part of the tree. You'd try to keep the matches dry. You'd try to sleep. You rarely succeeded. By morning, the sun returned, and the road was different. The ruts deeper, the puddles thicker. The world shone, but not with kindness, just with clarity. You could see now what you had survived. You could see, too, how much farther you had to go. Some days, you didn't make it. You turned back. Or you stayed where you were, not out of choice, but necessity. A busted wheel, a limping horse, a fever. You didn't fight it. You waited, and you hoped. And when you did arrive, when the town's shape finally rose against the horizon like something remembered from a dream, you didn't cheer. You didn't smile. You didn't rush in. You kept walking. You found water. You found shade. You found a place to sit, and you let the dust settle inside and out. Travel in the Wild West wasn't about adventure. It was about survival. It was about patience. It was about knowing that every step forward could be undone by one wrong move, one bad storm, one broken strap. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't move, but because the road didn't care if you did. It tested your will with every mile. It gave nothing back, and it waited for you to stop moving. Sleep now, traveler. Let the wheels stop turning. Let the reins fall from your hands. The journey is over for today. The road is still there. It always will be. But for now, rest. The dust can wait. Medicine was a whisper, and pain was a constant. In the Wild West, when something hurt, it stayed hurting. The pain didn't pause while you searched for a doctor. It didn't wait until you had time. It came sharp and fast, or slow and dull, and it stayed with you, like a shadow, like a weight, like a memory you couldn't shake loose. There were no pills to dull it. Not really. No antibiotics to fix what festered. No clean hospitals with white sheets and clipped voices. There was only the body and what it could take before it gave out. In town, if it was big enough, there might be a doctor or someone called one, a man with a bag of instruments that rattled when he walked, a bottle of laudanum, a saw, maybe a book, maybe not. He wasn't always trained. not in the way you'd hope. He'd seen things, tried things, knew what worked sometimes, and when it didn't, he shrugged with a kind of sorrow that had gotten too used to itself. He'd wipe the blade clean and say, "It had to be done," as if that was a blessing. For most folks, the doctor came after the fever had taken hold, after the leg had already turned green, after the cough had kept them up for 6 nights straight. Medicine wasn't the first step. It was the last. You waited until the pain became unbearable. Then you asked for help, and sometimes it was too late. In the absence of doctors, there were remedies, homegrown, half-remembered, taught by mothers and grandmothers, or read from the back of almanacs. You boiled willow bark for headaches. You chewed on tobacco leaves for toothaches. You poured whiskey on wounds and drank the rest to forget them. You bound broken ribs with cloth torn from the hem of a skirt. You cauterized cuts with hot metal. You prayed softly and often, not for miracles, but for relief. A cold wasn't just a cold. It could become pneumonia. It could become a death sentence, especially in winter, when the walls leaked wind and the blankets didn't hold warmth the way they should. A cut from barbed wire could fester, could swell, could turn black. A cough could tear something loose inside you. A burn could end your use of a hand. A fall from a horse could snap something deep and unseen. There were no x-rays, no scans. Just guessing, just time. Just the cruel wait to see if it would heal or not. Teeth went bad quickly. They cracked. They rotted. They ached until your head felt like a drum. You'd find a strong man, hand him a bottle, bite down on leather, and hope he pulled clean. There were no fillings, no numbing agents beyond alcohol, just grit, just endurance. And after, maybe a rag soaked in whiskey, and sleep if you were lucky. Children were especially vulnerable. Fevers came with no warning. Rashes bloomed and spread. You'd sit beside the bed, hand on their forehead, whispering songs you didn't believe anymore, just to keep them from crying. Sometimes they got better. Sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, the whole house grew quieter. The whole town, if it was small enough. And through all of this, pain never left. It wasn't an emergency. It was a companion. An old dog that limped behind you. You worked through it. You saddled the horse anyway. You lifted the bucket, even when your shoulder screamed. You chopped wood, dragging one foot. You cooked dinner with burns on your hands. There was no time to stop. Pain wasn't an excuse. It was part of the deal. And people rarely talked about it. Not because they were brave, but because no one wanted to listen. Everyone had their own hurt, their own limp, their own wound that healed wrong. So you gritted your teeth and muttered under your breath and learned to breathe around it. There were those who helped, of course. Women mostly, midwives, healers, people with herbs and instincts, and the kind of knowledge passed down in secret. They worked in kitchens, in barns, in corners where men didn't go. They stitched wounds. They set bones. They boiled roots. Sometimes they saved lives. Sometimes they didn't. But they tried, and they were trusted more than anyone else. Death didn't come dressed in black. It didn't arrive with drama. It came in a whisper, in a slow fade, in a fever that didn't break. in a wound that didn't close, in a breath that stopped while no one was looking. And when it came, it wasn't seen as failure. It was just the end of the story. And so you lived with pain. You accepted it. You folded it into your day like flour into dough. Always present, never separate. You didn't expect comfort. You didn't expect healing. You expected to get by, to do what needed doing, even if your body screamed while you did it. You wouldn't last a day, not because the pain would kill you, but because the idea that it might stay forever would be too much to bear. Out here, there was no timeline, no promise, just today. Just the hope that tomorrow wouldn't hurt worse. Your clothes weren't comfortable, and they never fit quite right. There were no wardrobes in the Wild West, no closets full of outfits for every occasion, no soft cotton loungewear, no stretchy waistbands, no tags that said machine washable. Your clothes weren't a form of self-expression. They were armor. They were tools. They were the first line of defense against dust, wind, heat, and the 1,000 small insults the day would throw your way. You wore what you had, and you had what could survive. Not what looked good. Not what felt nice. Just what didn't fall apart. Yet. Shirts were made of coarse fabric that rubbed your skin raw if you moved too much, which you always did. They didn't breathe. They didn't bend. They just clung to you, stiff and unyielding, until sweat softened them and dirt gave them shape. You wore the same one for days, maybe weeks. You hung it by the fire when it got wet, and you beat the dust out of it when it got heavy. It smelled like the road, like work, like you. Trousers sagged at the knees, tightened at the thighs, split at the seams when you reached too far or crouched too fast. They were patched in places, sometimes with thread, sometimes with string, sometimes with hope. You sewed when you had time, which meant rarely, and when you didn't, you let the hole grow. Let the wind whistle through it. Let your skin toughen underneath. Your boots weren't a fashion statement. They were survival. Thick leather, cracked from sun, stained from mud, worn smooth where they rubbed against the stirrups or the rocks or the skin of your own heels. You broke them in, or they broke you. You wrapped your ankles in cloth. You stuffed paper where the sole gave way. You cursed them when they pinched your toes, and you thanked them when they held together one more day. There were no socks that stayed dry, no gloves that kept out all the cold, no jackets that warmed without weighing you down. Your coat was heavy, and it smelled like smoke and sweat and livestock. It had too many buttons, or not enough. It hung wrong at the shoulders, but you wore it anyway, because the wind didn't care if it fit. The cold didn't wait for comfort. And for women, it was worse. Skirts long enough to trip over, corsets that pinched and bruised, petticoats that caught every thorn, shoes not made for walking, but for standing, posing, pleasing. And yet they walked, they worked, they bent and lifted and hauled and delivered babies in the same dress they wore to milk the cow. They rolled up their sleeves because there was no one else to do the job, and no one asked if they were comfortable. Undergarments were few and rarely clean. Laundering meant hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing with lye that burned your knuckles raw. Clothes didn't go into machines. They went into basins. onto washboards, over lines strung between trees. You waited for sun. You hoped for wind. You wrung them out with your bare hands and prayed the seams held. And once they were dry, they were still stiff. They scratched. They held the scent of soap and smoke and whatever had been cooked last night. They folded badly, but they were clean. Enough. Hats were essential, not stylish. Wide brims to block the sun. Straw, if you were poor. Felt, if you were lucky. They blew off in the wind. They got soaked in rain. They held the shape of your head and your sweat. And they told the world whether you were new or not. A clean hat was suspicious. A broken one meant you'd earned your place. Children wore hand-me-downs, even if the sizing didn't make sense. A boy of 6 in a coat made for a man of 20. A girl in a skirt that dragged through the mud. You rolled the sleeves, pinned the hems, tied things off with string. You grew into your clothes, or you grew out of them, or you wore them until they came apart, whichever came first. There were no changing rooms, no mirrors except the small cracked one above the basin. No time to wonder how you looked. You dressed in layers in the morning and peeled them off at night, stiff with sweat and dust and fatigue. Your clothes didn't define you. They didn't flatter. They weren't supposed to. But still, they mattered because they told the story of what you'd done. The frayed cuffs from hauling buckets, the scuffed knees from kneeling in fields, the burn mark near your collar from the time the fire sparked when you leaned too close, the red stain on your sleeve from the berry bush you passed on the trail, the loose stitch you repaired by lamplight with your fingers aching. Your clothes were a diary you wore on your back, and every mark was a sentence. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd be too cold, or too hot, or too sore, but because the itch would drive you mad. The seams would rub you raw. The weight would pull at your shoulders. You'd look for comfort where there was only necessity. And you'd find yourself tugging at your collar, scratching behind your knee, wondering how anyone lived like this. But they did, every day, in clothes that never quite fit, but always held on. Because in the Wild West, that was enough. The heat was a weight, and the shade was never enough. It didn't matter what time you woke. By mid-morning, the heat had already arrived. Not as a gentle warmth, not as a comfort, but as a burden, a pressure. The kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin, but settled into your bones. It came up from the ground, and down from the sky, and out from every breath of wind, until it felt like the air itself was squeezing you, folding you in slow and invisible hands that never let go. And the worst part? It didn't care if you were ready. The heat never waited. There were no air conditioners, no fans, no cold drinks pulled from humming refrigerators. You didn't come inside to cool off. Inside was just as bad, sometimes worse. The cabin walls trapped the heat, kept it spinning in the corners, pressed it into the floorboards. You'd sit near the open door, just to feel a breeze that never came. You'd wipe your forehead with the back of your hand, only to find your skin already slick with sweat. You didn't glisten. You didn't glow. You soaked. Your shirt clung to your back like wet parchment. Your hair stuck to your neck. Your socks squished in your boots before the sun even reached its highest point. There was no escape. Only coping. You moved slower. You tried to keep your hat pulled low You rolled up your sleeves, then rolled them back down when the sun bit your skin. Shade helped, but not much. The shade was thin and broken and temporary. The narrow line beside a fence post, the sliver beneath a tree whose leaves had forgotten how to offer shelter. You chased it across the day like a tired animal. And when you found it, you didn't sit in it. You leaned into it as if it might take your weight. Water became the only thing that mattered. You watched it. You rationed it. You carried it with the same reverence you gave to fire in the winter. Your canteen was heavy in the morning and heartbreakingly light by noon. You drank carefully, not just slowly, but carefully, measuring each swallow, letting it sit on your tongue like a blessing before it slid down your throat. If you were lucky, the well still held. If you weren't, you walked, miles sometimes, just to fill your bucket and carry it back, the wood of the handle digging into your palms, your arms trembling from the strain. The water would slosh, spill, warm in the heat of the sun, but you didn't waste it, not a drop. By afternoon, the heat changed. It deepened, thickened. It stopped pretending to be sunlight and became something heavier, a presence in the air. It pressed against your temples. It stole your breath. You'd try to work, splitting logs, tending fields, fixing fence posts, but your body slowed without asking permission. The sweat stopped cooling you. The salt on your skin turned gritty. You couldn't tell if your head hurt from thirst or effort, or simply the relentless, pulsing silence that stretched between each chirp of cicadas. Even the animals slowed. Dogs panted until their tongues hung limp. Chickens retreated to the narrow spaces beneath the coop. Horses flicked their tails, restless, eyes half closed, hooves heavy with dust. The sun didn't feel golden anymore. It felt white, raw, harsh, like a truth you couldn't escape. You looked up only once, just enough to regret it. The light made your vision blur. You blinked, turned away, and kept moving, not because it helped, but because standing still made it worse. At least if you worked. The minutes passed, sort of. And the wind, it didn't cool you. It scoured you. It picked up the dust and spun it into your eyes, into your mouth, into your ears, until every breath tasted like the land itself. You'd spit, and the saliva would dry before it hit the ground. Your lips cracked. Your tongue thickened. Your boots burned when you sat too long with your feet still inside them. The iron handle of a shovel could sear your palm. You learned to work with gloves, not to protect your hands from splinters, but from heat. Inside the cabin, it was no better. The stove still radiated from the morning's cooking. The windows let in light but not air. You might have left the door open, but it only let the flies in, hundreds of them, dancing slow and lazy around your face, your food, your water. You waved them away, again and again, until your arms gave up and you let them land. You shared the room with them. They weren't guests. They were residents. There was no break, no relief. You couldn't nap. You couldn't read. You couldn't even lie down. The bed was hot, the pillow hotter, the air still and thick enough to feel like water you couldn't swim in. So you sat, or you stood, or you worked until you didn't notice it anymore. And then, slowly, the light changed. The heat didn't disappear, not right away. It softened, pulled back, let go of its grip, one finger at a time. The sky turned gold, then orange, then something bruised and blue. You stopped sweating, finally, and realized how soaked you were. Your shirt clung to your back like a second skin. Your boots felt hollow, as though your feet had melted inside them. You peeled them off slowly, and the air that hit your toes felt like a gift. And maybe, just maybe, a breeze would come. Real this time. Gentle. Kind. It would stir the dust in the yard. Move the curtain at the window. Touch the back of your neck like a mother's hand. And you would close your eyes and sit still. Not because you were resting, but because movement might scare it away. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd overheat, but because you wouldn't understand how to endure the hours between morning and dusk, how to work without collapsing, how to drink just enough, how to move without burning, how to let the heat be there and not fight it. But they did, every day. They cooked in it, baled hay in it, rode out into it, buried people in it, and still woke up the next day to do it all again. The danger wasn't loud. It was everywhere. The Wild West didn't announce its threats with music cues or flashing lights. It didn't wear a black hat or twirl a mustache. It didn't barge through the saloon doors and shout. Danger out here was quieter than that. Quieter and constant. It lived in the cracks of the floorboards, in the silence between footsteps, in the rustle of grass when no one was there. It didn't need to show its face because it was already sitting beside you. You could feel it before you saw it. A shift in the air, a silence that came too suddenly, a bird that stopped singing, a neighbor who hadn't been seen in 3 days. You learned to notice those things. You learned to listen for absence. And you learned not to ask too many questions. Because sometimes questions were more dangerous than the answers. There were bandits, sure, highwaymen, drifters, men with hollow eyes and no hometown. They didn't always look like villains. Sometimes they looked like you. Dusty, tired, hungry. They'd ride into town slow, like they had nowhere to be, and leave just as slow, taking more than they came with. If you were lucky, they only took goods. If you weren't, they took more. And they didn't linger. There was no drama, no speeches, just a mark left behind, a bloodstain in the dust, a broken door swinging on its hinges. Law existed sometimes. A sheriff, a marshal, a man with a tin star and a quiet stare. But the law was thin. One man can't watch everything. One man can't be everywhere. And sometimes the man with the badge wasn't better than the one with the gun. Justice was a slippery thing. It traveled by rumor. It depended on who you asked. And out here, survival came before righteousness. Fights happened. Not over great causes. Over water. Over cattle. Over fence lines and stolen chickens and glances held too long. You didn't draw a gun because of honor. You drew because you didn't want to die. And when someone fell, the town didn't weep. They buried fast, talked little, and locked their doors earlier for a while. But not all danger came on two legs. Snakes lived in the shadows, beneath the porch, beneath the bedroll. Their rattle wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. You stepped wrong, you paid. If you made it back to town, maybe someone had a poultice. Maybe someone had a knife and a steady hand. If not, you lay down and hoped the fever passed before your heart did. Scorpions, wolves, cougars, bears. The land was wild because it still belonged to something older than you. You walked through it carefully. You slept beside it nervously. You listened at night for the sound of claws against wood, of breath too heavy to be wind. You kept your fire small and your scent hidden, and even then, it wasn't always enough. And disease, it didn't roar, it whispered. It came as a cough, then a fever, then stillness. You didn't always know what it was. You only knew that it moved quickly, that it took more than it left. It spread from hand to hand, from plate to plate, from the breath of someone you trusted. And when it came, people stayed home, not out of fear, but out of respect, because they'd seen it before. Children could vanish overnight, not from violence, but from a rash, from a shiver, from a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Parents didn't talk about it. They worked. They planted flowers if they had them. They told stories about stars and angels, not to comfort the child, but to keep from drowning in their own sorrow. Grief was private. Public mourning was a luxury. Out here, sorrow was another chore you carried, another ache you didn't show. Even the weather turned on you. The sun dried your crops. The rain washed them away. The wind knocked your house sideways. Fire started with a single spark and ended with nothing left. You could lose everything in a day. A lifetime of work gone in the time it took for a lantern to fall. And yet, life went on, not with celebration, with caution. You walked with your back to the wall when you entered a room. You nodded first when passing someone on the trail. You carried your rifle not to use it, but to be seen with it. You taught your children not to scream when they were scared, but to move, to hide, to hush. You made peace with the idea that safety was a moment, not a guarantee. You didn't stay up late because you were afraid. You stayed up late because vigilance was survival. You didn't sleep deeply. You didn't let your guard down. You rested in shifts. You taught your hands to reach for the knife before your eyes had even opened. And you prayed, if you prayed, not for miracles, but for one more quiet day. Because the West didn't shout its danger. It didn't wear a costume. It didn't arrive with fanfare. It simply was. You wouldn't last a day, not because the threat was too big, but because it was too constant, because your nerves would fray, your trust would dissolve. You'd look for safety in a place that didn't offer it, and you'd realize slowly that everyone else had already learned to live with that truth. There was no privacy, and loneliness was everywhere. In the Wild West, space was not the same thing as solitude. You could walk for hours across open plains, ride for days between towns, stretch your arms wide and touch nothing but air, and still feel like the whole world was watching. Because privacy wasn't something you had. Not really. And loneliness wasn't something you escaped. Not ever. Somehow, you could be completely alone and never feel free. Surrounded by people and never feel seen. Homes were small. One-room cabins mostly. Maybe two if you were lucky or had a bigger family. Everyone lived together, and everything you did was done in front of someone else. You slept in the same space, ate in the same space, bathed, if you could, in water someone else had already used, behind a door that didn't lock, with someone waiting their turn just outside. You shared not because you wanted to, but because there was no other way. You folded yourself into the rhythm of others' lives until you forgot where yours began. You could hear everything, every cough, every sigh, every whisper. There was no place to go to scream or cry or simply be still. And yet, somehow, you still felt alone. Because connection didn't come easy. Talking wasn't always safe. Emotions weren't a luxury most could afford. You didn't unburden yourself. You carried it until it became part of how you walked, how you stood, how you stared out across the land and said nothing. Letters came, sometimes, if they found you. Paper worn thin, writing faded. You'd read them 3, 4, 10 times, not because they said much, but because they said something. Something from someone who knew your name. And when you finished, you'd fold them carefully, tuck them into the lining of your coat or the bottom of a trunk, and hope for another. There wasn't always a reply. Mail didn't move fast or often, and sometimes it didn't move at all. You missed people, even if you didn't know who you missed. The warmth of a crowd, the hush of a room where you didn't have to speak, the casual comfort of hearing someone else make tea in the next room. You didn't have neighbors you visited regularly. You had neighbors you saw on the road and nodded to, unsure if they'd make it through the season. You didn't talk about feelings. You talked about the well, the weather, the crop, the cough that wouldn't go away, the wolf tracks behind the barn. You weren't expected to open up. You were expected to endure, to keep your head down, to keep going. At night, in the quiet moments, the loneliness would stretch out. It didn't cry out. It didn't demand. It just sat with you. In the way your chest felt heavy when you laid down. In the way your thoughts grew louder when the wind died down. In the way you remembered faces you hadn't seen in years and wondered if they remembered you. People married early. Not always out of love. Sometimes out of need. Sometimes just to have someone to speak to. Someone to watch the fire with. Someone to help with the labor that never ended. They shared everything, even silence, even resentment, even grief. And if one of them died, the house grew impossibly quiet, like a sound had been removed from the world and everything tilted sideways in its absence. And children, if you had them, were a mix of comfort and worry. You loved them more than you could say, and feared for them more than you could stand. You worked for them, sweated for them, prayed for them, and watched them leave one day, chasing something softer, easier, farther east or farther west. You watched them go and didn't say the words you wanted to, and the silence after they left felt heavier than anything you'd ever carried. Even in the saloon, among people, laughter was hollow. It lasted a moment, Then someone stood up, the piano stopped, and the silence returned, too quickly. You'd look around and realize no one really knew each other. Not fully, not deeply. Everyone had stories they didn't share, wounds they didn't name. Loneliness was a thread in everything. In the way the wind sounded through an empty barn, in the way the hills stretched out forever, in the way the stars blinked coldly above your head. Beautiful, yes, but distant, unreachable, quiet, in their own terrible way. And still, you kept going. Because out here, you didn't fight loneliness. You learned to live beside it, to carry it like you carried everything else. In your back, in your hands, in your eyes. You sang to yourself while you worked. You carved shapes into the handles of your tools. You told the chickens your thoughts. You whispered secrets into the prairie and pretended it whispered back. You wouldn't last a day, not because the loneliness would strike you down, but because it would wear you down, slowly, constantly, like water shaping stone. You'd miss the noise of other lives, the nearness of comfort, the feeling that you were known. But those who stayed, they learned not to love the loneliness, but to live with it, to walk beside it without flinching, to find quiet meaning in the shape of their days, even if no one else saw it. Money meant nothing until it meant everything. You might imagine that out in the wide, dusty sprawl of the Wild West, money didn't matter much, that the land was free, that the people were free, and that coins jingled only in the pockets of gamblers and gold seekers. But the truth is quieter and harder. Money wasn't a way to get rich. It was a way to survive. It wasn't about luxury. It was about leverage. And the smallest coin could mean the difference between comfort and cold, food and hunger. Another day, or the end of the road. Most people didn't have much of it. They bartered when they could. Eggs for nails, flour for cloth, a hand with the fence for a borrowed mule. But when the coins did come out, rough, worn, heavy with dirt from a dozen pockets before yours, they carried weight, not just the metal, but the meaning. A silver dollar could buy a week's worth of beans, a single bullet, or a ride out of town you didn't want to be in when the sun set. There was no banking in the way you'd expect. No accounts, no balances to check. You kept what you had in a pouch tied close to your body, or in a jar buried beneath the floorboard, or hidden in the chimney behind a loose brick. If you lost it, it didn't just hurt, it ruined you. A pocket picked, a room ransacked, a fire, a lie. You couldn't get it back. You started over, or you didn't. Paper money was rare and not always trusted. It changed value with the wind. A dollar in one state meant something different in the next. Some notes were counterfeits. Some were so old no one remembered what they were worth. So people held to coins, to silver, to gold if they had it, which they usually didn't. When a man paid for a drink, he didn't slap his money down with bravado. He set it down like it hurt, like he knew exactly how many hours it took to earn it. When a woman went into the general store with a child on her hip and 3 coins in her hand, she knew before she stepped through the door what she could afford. A sack of flour if the price hadn't gone up, maybe some lard, maybe a bit of sugar if the owner was in a generous mood. And even then, generosity was risky, because what you gave today might be what you needed tomorrow. Everyone walked a line. One misstep, one dry season, one sick cow, one broken plow, and your savings disappeared like smoke and wind. Debt was a different kind of prison. Not iron bars, but obligation. You borrowed when you had to, and you repaid however you could. A day of labor, a share of your crop, a promise that your son would come work the fields next spring. Some folks lent with kindness, others lent like wolves. And once they had your name on a scrap of paper, they didn't forget it. You couldn't buy respect with money. That came from work, from how you held yourself, from what you did when things got hard. But you could buy time. You could buy peace, a few extra candles, a second blanket, a bit more salt to keep the meat from spoiling. These were not luxuries. These were small mercies, quiet comforts, the things that let you sleep easier, if sleep came at all. For those chasing wealth, the gold hunters, the speculators, the men who struck out into the mountains with nothing but hope and a pickaxe, it was different. They gambled big, most lost. They came back with hollow cheeks and calloused hands and eyes that didn't focus quite right. But a few won. They walked into towns with heavy pockets, bought land, bought names, bought silence. For a while. But gold turned sour if you weren't careful. It made enemies. It drew shadows. It loosened your grip on the simple things, like why you came west in the first place. And for the rest, the farmers, the ranchers, the mothers, the blacksmiths, the barbers, money wasn't glory. It was breath. It was one more meal, one more shoe, one more month of school for a child who might not need letters, but needed something more than dust and drought. When you did get paid, it came in clinks. Coins counted carefully into your palm, one by one. You felt the metal. You weighed it. You knew it down to the last cent. And then you folded it into cloth, hid it in your boot, kissed it in secret, because you didn't know when more would come.